Can everybody hear okay? And hopefully see okay? Live stream, we'll just trust that you can and hear me all right. Is the volume okay for those? All right, great. Well, I don't know if anybody from the Goodnow Library is listening, but I do want to start by just thanking them for allowing me to speak. You know, I value this particular space as not just one of the great civic spaces in this part of the world, dedicated to learning and literary adventures and the discourse of ideas, but it's a neighborhood. It's a neighborhood space, and so while I've done these kinds of talks of other places, I've not done it in a place like this. I street and we either bike here or walk here with my children every Saturday afternoon. So it's just a joy to be here, and it's a cherished place for our family and an honor to be a part of the intellectual life of this cultural nexus at this library. So also thank Sam for really putting this on, and I think Sam is probably one of the finest servants that I know, actually. If anybody in the room knows Sam, you probably have and a dear friend of my work. Thanks, brother. Now, I better start a talk on anxiety and fear by putting you at ease, or trying to put you at ease a little bit, reducing the level of anxiety and fear in the room. And that's because when you suddenly realize that they're in the room with a psychiatrist, or at home on the live stream that suddenly might feel like they're in a Zoom session with a shrink, there's often a raising of the anxiety that happens. People get curiously uncomfortable when they know there's a shrink around. So I'm going to begin with a quick psychiatrist joke. So, ready for this? Hopefully this is not one that you've heard. So it's a quick one. So what do you call a medical student who earns C's all the way through medical school? Hopefully not your psychiatrist. That's the best I can do. The barrel of psychiatry jokes is deep, but that's one of my favorites. So, medical professionals are often, as some of you know, medical professionals are often required to begin talks by presenting their bias, any awareness that they have of where they're coming from, or dual or competing interests that they may have in themselves. So I'd like to begin by sharing with you what I regard not necessarily as bias, but where I'm coming from, and some identifications about that in delivering this talk. So first and foremost, some of you in the room know this, I am a Christian. I'm telling you this out of the gates for two reasons, really. First, because I don't want you to feel bamboozled when you detect that this talk is leading to a realization of the Christian worldview. Some may be familiar with the psychologist and cultural commentator Jordan Peterson, who's been famously in the news quite a bit over the last few years. And he was famously accused by the atheist philosopher Sam Harris in a recent public debate that they had in England of smuggling in Jesus, while arguing something that on the surface seemingly had nothing to do with Jesus. So I feel like they're being led toward some trick or some Jesus smuggling that you didn't see coming. So instead, I'm telling you right up front that I'm a fan of this Jesus, and this deeply informs how I see everything, including how I think about mental health problems. So more on that in a moment. And then just briefly, my second set of identifications I want to share quickly is that I'm married to a saint who is really a co-author of all the worthwhile things that I do, including this talk and every other talk, and I'm also father of 3 children that my wife is watching right now at home. So in that order, because it's after those identifications, somewhere after that, several others as well, that I then identify as a saint. Because psychiatrists are often thought of as secular priests. And it's true that by the numbers, my dual identification as a practicing Christian, or really even as a person of religious faith, and a psychiatrist, puts me into a philosophical category that is really a minority within my profession. Studies show that more of us espouse an agnostic or atheistic worldview, medical specialty. And we could discuss later during the Q&A if people are interested why that might be. But for me, a biblical understanding of human nature is actually a central driving force behind my professional work, rather than an obstacle to it. So I wanted to share briefly a slice of that worldview with you before I share a case study to bring us into the heart of the talk. So when I first began studying psychiatry and psychology, I was struck by how a biblical account of creation and of a fallen human nature and created world, I was struck by how that makes sense. Mental health issues are a problem for us. Not just anxiety, which is kind of the focus of tonight, but also depression and suicidality and self-harm and substance abuse and so forth. Because the Jewish and the Christian scriptures teach that the whole world, the entire physical and spiritual composition of the world, was created by God, but that the created order has fallen from God's original intention for that world. And that may be kind of easy to imagine if we ponder the atrocity that took place in Texas yesterday for those 19 school children, or whatever the count is up to now. Now mourning their murder by the 18-year-old high school student. An event like that seems to scream out to us a reminder that the world is not right. And as chilling and tragic as that recognition can be of evil, whatever we make of evil, that evil is happening out there somewhere, outside of us, equally arresting, if not more arresting, is the suspicion that our very own minds are all part of this fallen created order. So on the Christian view, our own minds bear, on the one hand, marks of the benevolent intention of a good, loving, powerful creator who, as the story goes, made us in his likeness to have agency, capacities, and creative power in the world. But on the other hand, our minds simultaneously bear the marks of the fallenness of the created world. This sense that our minds themselves are prone to decay and disorder and delusion and being wrong about things and ultimately death. And along the way, many opportunities for misapprehending ultimate reality. Part of the Hebrew scriptures, Isaiah 55 reads, "For my thoughts are not yours." This is the voice of God. "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." So on a biblical theory of mind, God's mind scales the heights, but our minds are inflected both with the goodness and creative energy of God and with the sense of tragedy, because they're fallen minds, they're fallible minds, often unworthy minds, and they often seem cursed and beset with all kinds of vulnerabilities. So because our minds are these kind of bent apparitions, as we look to our own minds to draw conclusions about the world, we're going to get a lot wrong. Our experiences of ourselves, of others, and of a God who may or may not exist, all of that is processed through the mind. So all of those conclusions, feelings, thoughts, attitudes, beliefs, all of that is destined at some level to remain somewhat fractured and fragmented and finite for as long as we live, just trapped inside a black box. Feelings are not facts. You know this. There are so many ways that our immediate felt experience of ourselves, of others, of the world, and of God, or of God's absence, there are so many ways that that experience is not a reliable guide to what we and the world and God are really like. Thus, on the Christian view of mental life, we predictably become disordered and confused and just plain in our perceptions. Christians, then, naturally that we're going to feel distant from this God in many ways, despite this alleged constant nearness. In the same way that we may appraise our circumstances to be massively threatening when in fact they're not. judge ourselves to be quite safe when in reality an unspeakable tragedy means the kids won't be coming home. So for me, this Christian understanding of the universal fallenness of our minds actually animates my drive to understand the mind using the best tools of science, alongside looking to what Christians believe is God's communication to us through the Bible, and in particular through the person of Jesus. Christians regard as God's ultimate word picture to us and who he is. So that's a bit of frame around where I'm coming from, just to not keep any of that hidden. So let me tell you a story about my day job. So as a psychiatrist and a therapist, I study and treat these disorders of the mind, sometimes with medication, but primarily with talk therapy. People often think I'm a psychologist. I actually do more psychotherapy than I do prescribing, and it's tended for various reasons to end up being more the domain of psychologists to do talk therapy. Various reasons for that. And it just so happens that the conditions I have specialized in treating are those that are not generally cured by medication or by other biological interventions that go by various acronyms, like, thanks. These treatments can go by various acronyms like ECT for electroconvulsive therapy, MS for transcranial magnetic stimulation, and so on and so forth. And medications in these biological approaches can be to help others better explore and understand and manage their own minds. So that means I must be the perfect person to talk with you about anxiety because I know tricks, right? All the tricks for managing it, and that must mean that I never get anxious, right? Well, if that was true, you wouldn't be inspired to listen to me because I'd be no authority on actually living with anxiety. But truth be told, I get plenty anxious. Not long ago, a walloping dose of anxiety about a patient that I'll tell you about here. And again, I'm used to beginning talks with a case presentation, so it's a fitting way to get going again, sort of ratchet up the intensity. So the subject matter, though, is fairly serious because this person was in dire straits. The patient was a man in his early 20s. I've changed a fair amount of the details to keep the case kind of concealed. The patient is a man in his early 20s who was born and raised in Japan and moved to the U.S. for college. His college trajectory was interrupted by multiple serious suicide attempts, leading to multiple hospitalizations that nearly ended his life. His parents, on the one hand, care about him dearly, and they live on the edge of fear and constant worry about his life. But on the other hand, they really struggle to understand his emotional experience. And they have their own tendencies to minimize and underexpress their own emotional life. They insist on their son's impeccable school performance at all costs. It's not what they mean to convey, but it's what gets conveyed. It's hard for them to accept his emotional difficulties. Suicide attempts occurred in the context of him feeling paralyzed by fear at his schoolwork, as though his mind would break under the pressure to excel. So recently my patient had reported accumulating anxiety and emotional difficulties around returning to school for the first time after a season of intensive treatment. He was 3 months into his first semester back, but he'd been unable to turn in a single assignment. So you can imagine where his provisional grades were for the semester. I talked with him about what was the paralyzing factor. He would his fear that his work would not measure up to his own standards or his standards. And now, at this point when the story was taking place, all were long overdue, and he knows that the best grade he can get on most of them turns them in. They're probably B's. He also knows that he is very bright and talented, and he feels certain that he should be getting straight A's. There's an unbridgeable gap between where he is and where he feels he should be, and his own sense of value and worth as a person is plummeting. He's back to questioning what his life is for, to the brink of seriously contemplating suicide. that's where we were. And what happened that made me suddenly very anxious, typical story for my work, was that my patient didn't, about it though, is that he didn't show up on Zoom. This was when we were still doing primarily Zoom sessions. He didn't show up at the appointed hour for the session. And that was a first, because he'd always been punctual and prepared. So now it was 30 minutes or so, and he was not only not there, but was not responding to my texts or my phone calls to check in. So it's concerning, right? So I reached out to the rest of my team to try to get more information, because we work in teams. Never worry alone, sort of one of our mottos. And I then learned from his family therapist. He had gone on from a group therapy session that morning in which he'd seemed inconsistent. And he'd gone on from there directly into a family therapy session that morning in which his parents had gotten quite exasperated with him and had communicated they couldn't understand why couldn't he just turn in his homework? Just turn it in. It doesn't have to be perfect, just turn it in. And he left that meeting angry and in tears and seemingly deeply ashamed. And in my mind, as I'm hearing this, I'm thinking these circumstances are dangerously close to the circumstances that preceded prior suicide attempts. So I'm more and more anxious with every new piece of information that I'm learning. My frame of reference was widening as I got more and more information about the situation. I got more and more worried, not less. And my growing fear told me that I needed more information. I needed to keep trying to expand the scope of what I knew so that I could reassure myself that he was safe. So I was looking for more information. I called another clinician on the team who sometimes in situations like this will go and do a home visit and check on someone. So I asked her if she would go and stop and check on him. So an hour later, that clinician called me and reported I had found my patient in his room taking a nap. Apparently he awakened calmly and explained that yes, he was struggling, but no, he was okay in the moment and had not taken any self-harming action and thought he would be okay for the rest of the day and could be all right until we all met next time. And he was sorry he'd missed the session. Look what happened here. My knowledge about my patient's circumstances and my own feeling had expanded again. And this time it was relieving, whereas it was escalating of my anxiety. So there's kind of a principle here that I've been thinking a lot about. So much about what makes us more or less anxious depends on the frame through which we view our current circumstances. There's nothing terribly wise about that. It's kind of a basic thing that we all probably know in our bones, but see where we can go with that. So to recap, 1 minute before the session was going to start, I was not at all anxious because my expectations had all been challenged. Things seemed to be going according to plan. 5 minutes later, when he hadn't shown, I started to get worried. 30 minutes later, when he still wasn't there and I heard about the morning's events, I was very worried. And then 60 minutes or so after that, after I learned about the nap, I was relieved. It's a roller coaster. So more information doesn't seem to always make us less anxious. When do we stop trying to get more information? When do we try to trust the information that we have? When do we try to rest easily enough with the information that we have? Well, all the internal psychological burdens that this young man is carrying, I realized as I kept thinking about him that day, and after I calmed down, thinking, okay, I won't see him again for another few days probably, and then I started to get worried again. I thought all the burdens he's carrying remain firmly in place. Nothing's actually changed about his circumstances. All the events that happened in his life that week, the sort of sword over his neck that he imagines about the imminent academic failure, that's hanging over his neck. The tension is not relieved, only for a moment, maybe. So I felt plunged right back into anxiety. So not only was this wider frame not relieving anymore, but it seemed to expose the inadequacy of the previous frame that I was looking to settle myself, to manage my fears. So how do we manage with this sort of dilemma about, when do we seek to expand or change our frame of reference, or when do we more expanding the frame of reference just seems to make something worse about our fear. And I thought, I may never be without fear for this person, for his safety, this person under my care, for the fate of our work together, and for his in the world. I remember shuddering as I drove home that day, thinking about him, and then, as thoughts tend to go, I thought more broadly about uncertainties in my own life, and my family's life, and my role in the life of my family. And just last night, as I was tweaking this talk a little bit, I was thinking about the massacre in Texas and remembering again that when my kids go off to school every morning, I have no assurance that I'll see them. But what frame do we all put around that kind of fear to get through our days? And a lot of the techniques of psychiatry and psychotherapy kind of work in this way. I'll try to break this down a little bit in more detail in a bit, but I want to say that although we seem to rely day to day on this process of frame setting and frame expanding to manage our fears, that process seems much more fragile and untrustworthy than we might like to think, and especially when we consider our deepest anxieties. So how, again, can we ever be sure we've widened the frame sufficiently and found a frame for our fears that is worthy of our trust? So in the rest of the talk, I want to explore this issue a bit of frame setting concerning all of our anxiety. And this is at a time when anxiety is, as everyone here already knows, rise in our society, in virtually every form. So we'll consider first kind of through a naturalistic frame of reference how we have some incredible tools in psychotherapy and psychiatry for helping ourselves and others manage these fears. But as we look closely at those techniques and tools through the lens of our deepest, I think that what we find is there's some holes, and actually it destabilizes the assurances that we sometimes use to get by the world. I want to consider how the Christian worldview provides 3 life frame expansions, which can transform how we live through anxiety of any given moment and the universal anxiety of our age. So, to look first at some of these, more deep anxieties. Well, I would submit to you that when we look at our existential condition as through a merely human frame of reference, I would submit that we have very good reasons to be afraid and anxious. And I realize not everybody in the room may comfortably identify yourself, myself, as deeply anxious and afraid. It may not be the thing you're proud of, a room of people. But if you're not someone who, in the pandemic, and it's continued to be on the rise, the general statistics about wellness and psychiatric illness, suicide, relapse on substances and alcohol, many measures of psychological burden have all increased and kept increasing. A major study from the American Psychiatric Association, this will be the only statistic I talk. Nobody loves statistics very much in a talk like this, but this is a revealing one. In 2021, last year, the APA released a study in which 62% of Americans reported feeling more anxious in 2020 compared with the previous year. And they broke down what the causes were of anxiety. Well, among the top causes were the fear of contracting COVID. But other top sources of fear were gun violence, relevant again today, the presidential election in 2020, the impact of systemic racism and structural inequities in our society, and sort of a variety of fears. The most revealing part of that study is this indication that unfortunately we didn't need COVID to become anxious. to become increasingly anxious as a society. In the same study, we learned that for each of the 3 years leading up to 2020, just below 40% of Americans reported feeling more anxious compared with the year prior. So what else is going on that's making our society more anxious? Well, I mean, this is a significant, successive rise in anxiety year after year before the pandemic ever began. So what's going on, of course, is a much more far-ranging discussion than we have time for tonight. Experts agree that a prominent contributor is the increase in social isolation and loneliness and disconnection. That's before the pandemic. We were increasingly losing meaningful proximity to one another long before lockdown. We know that there's something about being more alone that's deeply problematic for us and anxiety-raising. And it draws out our most deeply embedded anxieties about ourselves and the world. So, a little bit about how we think of anxiety from within the psychiatric and psychological frame. This may be basic for a lot of you in the room, but I'd say that like any psychological experience that we can study in a brain, we can conceptualize anxiety as occurring on multiple levels. We can talk about biology, what populations of neurons and clusters of networks and neurotransmitters and linked circuits in the brain are doing. We can talk about psychology, and that's kind of the level of subjectively lived experience, the I-ness, the me-ness about our conscious minds, the sense that we have of how we interpret, represent, and make meaning out of events in ways that sometimes seem not easily reducible to physical explanations. It's sensible to us on the notion that we have minds, not just brains. And then at a third level, as a Christian, I would include the spiritual level. And I'd say that has to do with how what's happening in our minds may relate to God's action toward us, or our responses, or lack thereof, toward Him. Some basic things we can say at each of these 3 levels about anxiety. Well, at the biological level, one simple and probably oversimplified way of thinking about what's happening when we feel anxious, people probably know about the amygdala, part of our brain that manages the fight or flight response and many of our emotional. And the amygdala gets stimulated by some cue that's either outside of us in our environment, like a shadow that looks scary or a sound that makes us startle, or it gets triggered by something inside of us, like a memory, a thought. And when the amygdala is firing at a certain intensity and frequency, to associated brain regions, it up the normal regulatory of other parts of the brain. And one of the most important brain regions of the amygdala is the prefrontal cortex. And that's the most highly developed and evolutionarily unique aspect of our brains. It's responsible for some of our most complex, highest order psychological functions. So normally, a signal of fear comes from the amygdala and normally recruits our prefrontal cortex to come online, help us think through and take perspectives and respond sensibly to even the most intensive feelings. But we're not spared, actually, the visceral experience of fear, because that communication from amygdala to prefrontal cortex, that usually takes a little time. One example I'll never forget is I was riding my bike near the Charles River when we lived in Cambridge years ago, and I don't know why I was riding my bike into pitch black of darkness, pretty late. I probably shouldn't have been out there doing that, but I was riding right along the river. I guess it seemed beautiful, and there was a sudden rustle of bushes right next to me. And I even had headphones on, which is really not smart, especially at that time of night, but I was listening to music, and this sudden rustling in the bushes just took over the music. It was right next to me. And I think my body is pedaling at lightning speed, right? Before the pre-cortex is even kicked in at all. Before thought comes fight or flight action. We all know this. That's a vastly oversimplified understanding of the biology of anxiety, but it can suffice to help us remember that what's going on in our brains at a physical level has some correlation with what's going on at a psychological level. And it's going to be relevant to what may be going on at a spiritual level too. We can't pull apart that threefold cord. And this is important to remember about biology. That individual people have between-person differences in the sensitivity of these regions of the brain to emotional overwhelm. I might be more biologically sensitive to certain cue than anyone else in the room, and so on and so forth. It's going to be highly individualized. What gets our amygdalas going, just at a purely biological level? Well, let's think about the level of psychology. Be more like obstacles, or even harmful. And we know that a main adaptive function of anxiety is to inform us about threats, inform us about uncertainties that may actually be threats that we've got to somehow deal with. Either get away from or neutralize, problem solve in some way. And we all remember back to the start of the pandemic when we all had some adaptive fear about getting COVID-19, and that motivated us to take behavioral precautions, like wearing a mask, wiping down our mail. And we know that for anxiety to be truly adaptive, it can't become overly generalized beyond the true scope of the threat. For example, if I have a generalized fear of snakes, that's helpful if it steers me clear of boa constrictors, or vipers, or king cobras. But if it becomes too generalized, as we see in examples of anxiety disorders of different kinds, then we're going to also be running away screaming from the garter snake that's harmless, when we're mowing the lawn. So that's a basic picture. But what I'm getting to is that over the course of our development, it helps us calibrate our fear responses by teaching us our fears correspond to real risk in the world. And thus can be shed over time. So in my household with our kids, we have a saying that goes, it's scary, but not dangerous. It's scary, but not dangerous. And so with that, we're hoping to validate with our kids the fear that's real. Indeed, much of life is truly scary, but that not all of our fears are reliable guides to what to think or how to behave. In this way, my daughter was able, with my wife's help, to actually get onto the Little Mermaid at Disney World and confront the animatronic Ursula. Which fears are adaptive and which are not adaptive is based largely on that we make about whether the intensity of our fear or the duration is that proportionate to the true level of risk. That's how we assess this. That's a therapeutic skill that therapy has co-opted and packaged up from life in lots of different ways. Some therapies will call that the skill of fact-checking. Check the facts, we'll often say to our and it's simple enough to do that when we have a concrete, specific, circumscribed about something. And it's that when one does not have an anxiety disorder, or when we're evaluating commonplace causes of fear, and when we find that the facts are clearly on the side of reassuring ourselves. But what about when our anxiety is not like that? What about when our anxiety actually escalates? Like in my case example. Anxiety actually escalates the more we consider the true nature and extent of the threat we fear. My patient isn't safe. That's true. And the more I think about it, the more I contact with that reality. I don't get away from that. I get closer to that. More anxious rather than less. So I think there are lots of forms of anxiety that the pandemic has kind of punctuated this within. And just some quick examples are anxiety for our own basic health and well-being, and that of our families, but also our separation anxiety, or distancing socially from one another, that worries about being disconnected from each other. We had worries about how life would be or whether it would would return to some new normal. We had anxiety about the losses that we'd face. We've reached now over 1 million deaths in this country, and I think a few weeks ago, so there have been real losses. Those anxieties were not unfounded. And finally, this COVID crisis has provoked us to kind of get back to some of these existential anxieties about the very term of our lives. So what does it mean that all the ordinary things we counted on and took for granted can be so easily swept away by this virus? Or that lives entirely can be swept away? An 18-year-old's choices. So with all of these anxiety in mind, as you think about more personal aspects of your lives that you control, think about which anxieties of our time do most hit you. And as we recognize those more inescapable sources of anxiety, well, how do we manage them? Well, psychiatry and psychotherapy offer a lot of answers. And as a card-carrying, practicing clinician, I'm here to say out of one side of my mouth how helpful and engaging those strategies can be. I wouldn't be practicing this profession if I didn't believe that. We won't go through all the different therapies that address anxiety. Over, I think last time I checked, like 1,000 plus different kinds of psychotherapies. But some basic behavioral techniques managing anxiety include, probably familiar to most of us, mindfulness techniques. Mindfulness in a nutshell, when we practice it, it's about bringing our attention to bear on just what is true, objectively, in a non-judgmental way. What can we just observe as being the case about ourselves and our surroundings in a neutral, non-judgmental way? That's a really useful skill for life. You can't get without being able to do that, at least some of the time. Undoubtedly, concept. We do it all the time without even knowing that we're doing it. We are modulating breath. We're relaxing and clenching different groups without even knowing it. And that's actually directly influencing anxiety in the mind. There are all kinds of bags of tricks that we use with our patients, standing on your tiptoes and activating this other sense that we call proprioception, because it's hard to be ruminating on your anxieties if you're more worried about falling over onto the floor. So we've got all kinds of tricks to help people distract or relax, and distractions about swiveling the spotlight of your attention so that you're just I think of it as swiveling the spotlight on a stage, off the cue that is so activating of the amygdala onto something that's a more neutral stimulus, a more neutral cue. So patients do things like making lists to fill their mind with A to Z, songs that were hit singles in the 80s. A to Z, go. And I had one patient who had memorized the list of British monarchs all the way back to the beginning of the monarchy, and she could do them in forward, backwards order. And that would be one of her skills for managing acute anxiety. We talked already about fact-checking, which is just to widen that frame of reference by looking to reliable sources of information, more reliable than our feelings at the moment, to expand the frame and change our estimation of how likely is that threat to really happen, or how catastrophic would it actually be if it does come to fruition, we're worried about. And then we have something called opposite action, which comes from, it's a basic behavioral principle, but famous these days in CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, or dialectical behavior, which is an area that I work in for personality disorders. And the idea of opposite action is actually just to act in the way you do, and do it over and over again, because eventually that will help extinguish. And that works very well, although it can take a long time. Many other anxiety management techniques, and I will spare you for the details, but across different models of psychotherapy, not just behavioral therapy, but what we call classical talk therapy or psychodynamic or psychoanalytic therapy, most clinicians of different theoretical stripes will agree that the best technique for managing anxiety is something called reality acceptance. Accepting what is true, approaching and confronting head-on rather than avoiding, what is true about ourselves and the world that we live in. So the question of managing anxiety, if reality acceptance is the deepest and most enduring way to manage anxiety, and the way we do reality acceptance is we have to have some anchor points in what's true about reality. We can't separate the task of managing our fear from what we believe about the world. It's inseparable. So here's one place where I see philosophy and spirituality and our worldviews directly impinging on the truths that we're going to on as we try to do this skill of reality acceptance, by what our therapists might call it. So again, the thing we're doing with reality acceptance, we think, is helping people fully face and tolerate the emotions that are generated. What I want to suggest is that when we turn to the more existential anxieties that we all feel in this age, the psychiatric world's techniques for managing that anxiety have this major existential loophole. Because as we've seen, some of our more disquieting forms of anxiety are not so clearly out of proportion with reality. The more we look at them, the more we think about yesterday's in Texas or the death toll from COVID, the more we look at that, the more we're aware of the inevitability of suffering. The way we're disconnected from each other in unfathomable, unpredicted ways. That some children die before their parents. The reality of human that we see on display yesterday. Our own fears of ending up alone. Fears of being unloved or only loved conditionally based on how well we perform, like for my patient. And as soon as we contemplate these realities, we get that nausea that Sartre spoke of, and we feel a sense of the absurdity of life, as eloquently captured by Camus. And there was this brilliant piece in the New York Times, I don't know if anybody caught it towards the beginning of the pandemic, by this author, Alain de Botton, probably not pronouncing it properly. He was actually referring to Albert Camus' novel, The Plague, and drawing lessons how to live during a pandemic from that fictional story about a contagion fighting its spread. And this columnist, de Botton, writes, for Camus, when it comes to dying, there's no mystery. There's no escape from our frailty. Being alive always was and will always remain an emergency. It is truly an underlying condition. So there's this notion that, plague or no plague in the world of transmissible diseases around us, there is always the plague. What we mean by that is our susceptibility to loss and suffering and these events that can render our lives seemingly instantaneously meaningless. And David goes on to say, one of the most brilliant one-liners that I think I've ever heard, he said, life is a hospice, never a hospital. That's just like indelible in my head. So for those of us who feel we're sometimes in that camp with Camus, contending with that fear of life as a hospice, not a hospital, then the COVID crisis or the Texas massacre, these are sparks that actually remind us of our limitations and our vulnerabilities. And if that's our reality, which on a naturalistic framework, which we have to practically work within as psychiatrists and psychologists and therapists, if that's the fullness of truth about ourselves and our world, it's hard to see how any of these techniques really can help. If I really think about that reality, it's not so settling to focus on my breath as we do in mindfulness. How can I escape my anxieties to make a sense of meaning out of a life of service to others? We'll talk about making contributions and living for others and finding your values. But for most of my patients, when they really think about that, they say something like, you're trying to get me to kind of concoct something out of thin air, to find a sense of value that I don't see in the world, and I don't see how it could be there in the world. What do you say to that? As whether you're a shrink or not. The reality is, for me, day in and day out in my clinical practice, the best of our therapeutic techniques can feel woefully incomplete. So now I want to pivot in the last section of this to then propose 3 frame-expanding elements that become possible upon stepping into a Christian worldview that I believe can transform how we approach anxiety. And to be clear, I'm not arguing that Christianity is true because it helps us live more comfortably or feel less anxious. That would be an obvious logical fallacy. And furthermore, I don't think the balance necessarily even tilts in that direction. I would say that following Jesus generates at least as many problems for me in trying to figure out how to live as it solves. So I'm not actually going to try to persuade anybody that Christianity is true tonight. That's a subject for many other conversations. But what I want to consider just in the final part here is what might happen to our approach to anxiety? How might it change if we were to expand the frame to include the Christian worldview of God as Trinity, God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? These mysteriously linked 3 persons within a classical Trinitarian view of God. So we'll talk about each one. And just a quick word about the Trinity. This is a paradox. It's a mystery. And just saying that, I'm aware that can seem like a kind of hand-waving, exit strategy. Like this is where I'd like to not be the one giving the talk. To try to explain the Trinity is something Christians have struggled to do for 2,000 years. But what we can say is it's a statement that Christians hold that describes something important about God being one in essence, yet 3 in personhood, with each person somehow equally and fully God, yet revealing aspects of his and interacting with our lives in different ways. So for now, let's hide doubts about the truth of Christianity as best anyone can, and just consider trying this frame expansion on for size to include a Trinitarian God. How might that change our experience of anxiety? So I have 3 proposals corresponding to 3 persons in the Trinity, 3 ways of relating to God. The first proposal is that as we expand our frame to include God the Father, we have a good reason for an ultimate frame of hope. There are a lot of stories of God the Father in the Hebrew Scriptures, known as the Old Testament, that attest over and over again that we have this God who loves to comfort and encourage those who are afraid. There are many, many passages I could have chosen for this, but the one I always go back to is, some in the room may know this, in 1 Kings 19, we have a key part of the story of Elijah, the quintessential man of God for his time. And he's drowned. It sounds a lot like depression and isolation and despair, and there's suicidal longing here, longing to be dead. There's hopelessness, anxiety. You think, well, what's gotten into him? He'd seen a miracle, as the story goes, and these have been proven in his life. And people say, too blessed to get depressed. But now he's dejected and he's running away across the desert. And he's sure he's got nothing left to give. And he's disappointed because in his mind, his mission of showing God the Father, Yahweh, to Ahab and Jezebel has utterly failed. And again, he's withdrawn, he's hopeless, he can't experience pleasure, even in his experiences with God, and he feels worthless. He'd gone an additional day past leaving the servant behind into the wilderness just by himself, and it seems like he may not have had intent on coming back. And at some point he stops running and he asks God to take his life, saying, I'm no better than my ancestors. And then he just falls asleep out of sheer exhaustion, which is often the experience of, this ratcheting up of levels of anxiety. People often fall asleep from the exhaustion of it. God actually in the story meets him in that place. God the Father first comes and addresses his physical needs and ensures that he's fed and gives him a nap and a meal and kind of prepares for the frame-widening truth that God's got to share with him. And after meeting those immediate biological needs, asking him this searching question twice. What are you doing here, Elijah? And his answers indicate that he's lost his perspective. His frame is narrowed. And then, as some of you know, there's this holy rock concert of sorts, and there's this sort of great epiphany, and God seems to pay his location, but it's after all that God really speaks in that still small voice, as it says. And God's then speaking to correct the faulty frame. Because Elijah's saying basically, God, I'm the only one left. You promised that there'd be this remnant, that there'd be others that would hear. And God actually says, no, I've proved 7,000 others in Israel that you don't know about. He reminds Elijah to look up, see that actually God the Father has a higher perspective on current events, and encourages him to be strengthened, not weakened, but to be strengthened by the reminder that his perspective is not the widest frame. We usually see that as a reason to feel weak and vulnerable, but here it's offered as a strength. If we can depend on this God the Father. And that's then how Elijah is able to look forward and keep himself moving again. He had said, I'm no better than my ancestors, just let me die. But as long as there's life, God has a plan and there's a job to do. And moving anxiety and uncertainty is possible and helped by knowing that we only see through a glass darkly. If that's part of the truth that we come to accept, that our vision is blurry, but there may be this God the Father who has an ultimate providence in our life, that's going to be a wider perspective that can allow us to keep going. And a wider perspective at the end of the Bible is, of course, in the book of Revelation, and where it says, as part of this vision, it says, and I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. And he who was seated on the throne said, behold, I'm making all things new. What if that were the ultimate frame in our lives? I admit I can barely believe it myself. But what if it were true that this Father God would merely erase or void out our minds that are marked with anxieties and riddled with despair, but promises to transform that mind and redeem it and make it new in ways we cannot currently fathom? That's a hopeful ultimate frame, and admittedly one that it's hard to believe in. But our response to trying on that frame, second proposal. I'll try to wrap this up. Second proposal, to leave if you need to. Second proposal, as we widen our perspective to include Jesus the Son, we have a person to trust and follow. A person, not a concept or a formula or a technique, but a relationship with a reliable person who knows suffering, because as the story goes, he took it onto himself. Remember the buddy Jesus from a few years back? The bobblehead Jesus? As if we could reduce Jesus to this action figure. And I've thought, if he was an action figure, which one would he be? Would he be like Steven Seagal or Indiana Jones, or who would he be? When you think about our action and adventure heroes, the ones that we admire, not the ones who are impervious to feeling fear. It's the ones who feel it and somehow steel themselves and move through it despite their, got a bad feeling about this, or I hate snakes, but then plunges into the pit. And this fits with what we want and need as children. I won't go into a full deep dive on attachment theory, which is a big interest of mine. just offer it to you as something that I see and have come to believe in, and I think there's good evidence for, that we listen and learn best from those attachment figures who we come to believe have experienced something of what we're experiencing. But not just that. Not just that they can relate to us and validate us. Because as we all know, there's this caricature of the endlessly validating, reflecting therapist that eventually starts to sound like just looking into a reflecting pool. You're just hearing somebody, yes, that is so hard. Yes, oh, it's so painful. We all know that that's helpful. It's necessary, but to a point. But what we need as babies is to actually be in a relationship with someone who has some what we're going through, but also a wider perspective, who themselves has learned to manage it, who fully can grasp what we're experiencing, but also equally has an outside perspective which is not accessible to us in the moment. That's how we learn to have our own minds. That's how we learn to regulate our own minds. It's how we develop the capacity to trust. So when I consider as a therapist, I am someone who believes that it's powerful to sit in a room with someone in close emotional proximity. That's powerful. It's a powerful, God-given scientific tool and spiritual tool. But when I think about how therapy works and how it often goes, what I come up against is rediscovering over and over again that actually who I really am and who I think we really all are is we're people that are susceptible to all manner of emotional pain that we can't fully understand about each other, that we can't truly perfectly validate. We do exist at an unremovable social distance from each other long before lockdown. But we have this long, not just for others who can come up close to our hurts, but for the proximity of others who also can give us some hope that is transformed and can attest to that. And that's what we believe about Jesus, that we have this God who is not just an actor, but who knows firsthand what it's like to fear behavioral therapy. If God is really both all-powerful and all-vulnerable, he would be the only figure, whether Jesus was ever truly afraid or vulnerable like that, because we often think he's supposed to be the antidote to fear, or he's the one who's always showing up. Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, the night before he was, as the story goes, crucified. And we see this picture of this person who Christians believe is the Savior, on his knees, praying in desperation, asking for the cup to be taken from him. And it seems as the only way I can make sense of that story is to say, in that moment, this is what Lewis says, in that moment, God must have withdrawn the foreknowledge of exactly what was to come. Because otherwise it's not sensible for him to be praying in such despair and desperation. Right? If he just could access, the other side of the cross fully, why would he be in despair? I mean, here we have a one who goes on to conquer it. He's then the person who goes on, I've said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. He says both. He relates to us in both ways. And that is the perfect dialectical combination of vulnerability and proximity to our suffering, alongside of victory and transcendent hope. So again, consider, how would you approach anxiety differently if that becomes the ultimate frame around your life? Techniques or humanly derived wisdom, but an intimate relationship with a person like that who died for you and me. Third and final and fast proposal. As we widen our perspective to include God as Holy Spirit, we have an intimate who gives us good tools to help us flourish despite. So who's the Holy Spirit? Well, again, we could be here for hours, and I promise I will stop soon. Jesus tells us about him. I'll just give one verse from John 14, where Jesus says to the disciples, "But the Helper, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name. He will teach you all things and bring to your remembrance all that I've said. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Then let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. Who helps us expand the frame of reference, who's on duty to do that for us, with us, and through us for others, when we are troubled and afraid. And so that person of the Holy Spirit, that picture of God, then becomes a relational conduit. Again, it's a relationship, right? I can go over. But the top two tools that we hear about when Jesus talks about the Spirit and in Ephesians 6, the top two tools are to spend time in prayer and in the Word of God, in Scripture. I can say more about that if people are still hanging around. But Christians believe that by relating to the Spirit, by looking back at our anxiety through the eyes of that intimate, loving Spirit who is fully God, looking at our anxiety through that wider frame, that's actually how we don't reduce our anxiety, but it does get transformed. It's not a technique. None of this is. Psychiatrists and psychotherapists have to offer are very helpful concepts and techniques and prescriptions, and yes, also relationships, healing relationships. But when we kind of break down those techniques and those prescriptions and even those relationships, which I really believe in, but when we look closely at them, I think we see the gaps and the imperfections. And that reminds us of our longing for a wider frame that psychiatry and psychotherapy can offer. And I'd better pause there, or I might have a mutiny in the room. But if people are interested, keep talking about some very practical applications of what I've said. If people need to leave, again, feel free. I know it's a small, room, so don't be too self-conscious if you need to. Who will be the first to walk out? Feel free to. But if anybody wants to stay, I'm sticking around. So questions, responses, what didn't you hear about that you'd like to hear more about? What do you disagree with? Objections?
I'm just so struck by the fact that Christians who are to their worldview might do better than non-Christians or secularists with certain types of therapies because of the roles that they have. And yet, I'm not sure you can prove that very well, but what's been your experience with that? You're sort of limited on how you can express one's faith in a practice environment.
I'd say yes and no to that last part. Yes, there's a call it a limitation, then it's one that I willingly and even eagerly embrace in a sense, because not most of my patients actually would identify as not religious, agnostic or atheist, and or have some other spirituality that's perhaps more, they would say themselves, is more vaguely defined or that they're more unsure of. So I don't tend to think, and some Christian identifying therapists and clinicians will have a different position. I find, at least working with my patients, in my experience, actually, I think it would be detrimental for me to be more explicit, and you're not suggesting that I do that, but to be more explicit and upfront about my own religious worldview. So I find actually, and this is where I think we've learned something from Freud and all of his descendants, and we've learned something about this concept of therapeutic neutrality and how it actually enhances at times what can be gleaned from a therapeutic relationship when one is sometimes a little bit more unknown or unknowable. I also work with deeply want to feel known and know the other person that they're working This does come out. So that's the yes to the yes and no part. I think, it just comes out over time. I think people do kind of get to know, that there's a little wider frame of reference here that I'm operating with. And sometimes, eventually we'll ask about that. And there's a chance to, to respond to questions that are coming from the person rather than me putting it out there into the field between the two of us. But your real question, I think, was about, do Christians, perhaps by virtue of having this wider frame, emotion in general, do they do better in these therapies? And right, it's hard to study that. There's some of Harold, Koenig's research on looking at spirituality in general and religiosity and how this is a predictor of wellness. There's Tyler Vanderweel's work at the research study that I'm on. He's a collaborator and he's the director of the Harvard Center for Human Flourishing. And they've got all kinds of epidemiological data that show that over years, longitudinally, that actually there's something about religious attendance at religious services and other measures of religiosity that is associated directly with higher well-being, measures of flourishing, character virtue, and that those are all protective against severe forms of psychiatric illness. So I think there is some population level. But anecdotally, I could be here till the end of the night about, I wish I could, and maybe this should have been the talk actually, rather than next time. But, I've got all these stories about patients that would not think they're Christians, and not at the beginning at least, but people who, in working together over the course of the years, do actually stumble upon something that starts to look like a relationship to this Christian God. And just two quick, really general points here is that, I work with people who have personality disorders, and borderline personality disorder is, if you kind of think about it in a nutshell, it's essentially a deep-seated anxiety, related challenges, but that center around this fear of being alone, this sense of being profoundly disconnected and not cared for and not supported by anyone else in a full way. That's just a nutshell. And we think that that's kind of the engine of a lot of the symptoms of self-harm, suicidality, and emotional instability, and behavioral impulsivity, and all of that. And if you think about putting this frame we've been talking about tonight around that fear, that deep-seated fear about, will anyone ever know me? And if they did get to know me, how could they love what's there? Because these are people who have this deep belief of themselves as evil, as unlovable, can't do anything right, that sort of thing. Well, think about, that frame expanding move that we talked about tonight about Jesus the Son. This is the intimate partner, and Spirit too, these intimate partner who actually knows my suffering better than I know it, and has walked in my shoes, and has walked in shoes that I'll never be able to walk in, and conquered that sense of aloneness and despair that we see in Jesus in Gethsemane, right, among other places. That idea and that person, I have witnessed transform many of my patients' lived experience. And how I would talk about that in a professional meeting is very different from how I would talk about it, at a place of worship. Although increasingly I'm talking about it in those ways in professional meetings, actually. But yeah, that's just an example. Take narcissism, narcissistic personality disorder, which I see many people with those kinds of problems. And if you reduce narcissism to its nutshell, well, that's basically about sense of self. And the story of Narcissus, we all know the myth. Narcissus is caught and fixated by his own reflection in the reflecting pool. That's the story. And there's various versions of that myth. But in all the versions of the story of Narcissus, something bad happens to him because he's too fixated on his own image, his own sense of himself. And the sort of modern application of that, for understanding narcissism in our time is, it's all about self. It's all about the anxiety over managing how I look, how I seem to others, how I perform. Am I doing it perfectly? And underneath all of that apparent grandiosity, that sense that sometimes these people can convey that they're better than others, or looking down on others, underneath all of that, how we understand this is that there's this deep fragility and this deep, vulnerable anxiety about, can I ever be good enough? For anyone, for others, for myself? Can I ever live up to standards and expectations? Because there's this sense of self-criticism. So if you take that as kind of the nutshell of narcissism, and that's operationalistic, but that's a big emotional problem in narcissism, wrap these frames around that problem. Well, again, what does the Christian worldview say to our drive to excel according to our own standards or the standards of other human beings? Well, the Christian worldview just sort of plows right through all of that and says, you got the wrong frame. It's not about what you do, it's about what Jesus did. And that story is right here for the taking. And I would say I'm even more amazed by some of my narcissistic patients discovering that story than I am by some of the borderline discovering the story. It's amazing to see the total turning on its head of the paradigm someone's living with around achievement and need to perform and be perfect. I've witnessed people's lives changing, not because of anything There was a question in the back, though.
Yeah, mine's not so much about what you do. A question. So I love the framework piece. That was super helpful. Does anybody ever feel like you're like, okay, I'm going to really focus on letting go of the anxiety, turning it over to God, and you're like cruising along for 10 minutes, and then you're like, wait a minute, I'm not paying attention. I'm supposed to be obsessing about that.
Yeah.
Like,
You're asking, is that useful?
Well, no, you feel irresponsible if you're not paying attention to it. Like if it's not in the front of your mind because it's so, yesterday's so painful, and everything's painful. Everybody's in so much deep pain.
Yeah.
And such teeny tiny people at the beginning of the school year, these parents are dropping their years old, and you can physically, I have never experienced a parent before because they trust nothing they have. And yeah, I feel irresponsible if I'm not anxious about something. If I'm not carrying that anxiety, it's like I'm giving it to somebody else to carry. Like, shouldn't I be as worried as everybody else?
Yeah. Well, maybe, if I'm understanding the question properly, which I may not be. No, I think you are. And again, we can wrap up after this again. I don't want to keep people too much longer, but it's a question, I think, because I think you're kind of asking, and correct me if I've got it wrong, is sort of, how do we tell what's the proper amount of anxiety and worry? How do we then manage that as Christians? Well, one point I'd make is this: if we're getting really hung up on, am I doing enough? Am I doing it just right? Do I have exactly the proper amount? Am I spending the right number of minutes through the day? We can get really obsessional about that, about our own performance. Myself, get really performance oriented. It's one reason I choose this kind of work, right? Work with these kinds of folks. These things I can relate. I think when our vision is becoming narrow, sort of our own perceptions of our own activity, we might be missing something about the relationship. So I think practically what I'd be thinking is, well, all right, I'm going to take a moment to kind of go back to the wider frame of that relationship and talk to that person and actually ask God, am I getting a little caught? Should be. And that's actually a lot of the time for a lot of us, I think, right? I didn't know how anxious to be about this talk coming tonight. I didn't. Well, what do you do with that? I can keep kind of a regimented way. I can keep kind of ruminating and trying. For the Christian, well, it's like the child who doesn't know what to do with himself, going to mommy or daddy and just flinging themselves, at that person. Well, I don't even know what I don't even know what to call it. Just be with me. Just be in proximity. Just hold me. Just listen to me. And somehow, it's a miracle when this happens between two human beings, right? Many people in the room are more experienced than I do with this. It's a miracle. But it's that, this relationship with the perfect attachment figure, which we only, show that in echoes. So I think I'm trying to say, back to the person. And I think practically that's what I'd say to a friend or to That's what I said to myself driving over here tonight when I thought, oh gosh, I tend to be long-winded. I hope I stop myself at the right time. And here I am. If I could with this right now, thinking it's 8:30, I've kept people here this long. And then I could think, well, they're free to leave when nobody's got them tied down in here. They're free to walk. I think, oh, but I'm at this podium and it must be really anxiety to walk out. I could drive myself nuts. And I'll be the last one in the library tonight. So might as well lock me in. Well, at the end of the day, I'm going to be able to decide, the frame of reference I'm going to bringing myself back to is one of this Jesus who has saved me from this. And it's the now and not yet kingdom, right? I'm not saved from it now. I'm not worries about how much to worry. I'm probably going to be a worrier, my whole life. For now. But we have this ultimate revelation. We have this picture